I think from that translation by Stephen Weinberger for the Ulma Institute for Tibetan Studies is the first half of the Gomang collected topics. So I guess that means there are 24 chapters. And fortunately, the 11th chapter is Chapa Chokyi Senge's notorious creation, notorious because the scuttlebutt is that he created it to put down the famous nuns whose debating prowess was so great that they were defeating monks. And so he sprung this on them. And if it's true, it may be scuttlebutt. And I asked Betsy, who was there for much of Ngao Lingden's teaching in Wisconsin, as I remember. She was in India also around that time. And then for Lati Rinpoche and Locha Rinpoche's teaching in Virginia, she said she thought this story was conveyed to us by both Lati Rinpoche and Locha Rinpoche about Chapa Chokyi Senge's having created this to spring it on. You can imagine if this was sprung on a group of people. In other words, you wouldn't spring it on them by sending them the book. You would spring it on them in the debating, in a debating matchup. And if you took a look at it, you were probably nauseated by it, that 11th chapter. I started reading it and, I studied the Pupujo version of it. And, it's a tangle of words, which people learn, and it's a bit much. Giant Sheba in the 12th chapter gives his own system's version, which is quite different from Chapa's version. In other words, Chapa put out a system, and then Giant Sheba made up his own version, quite different from Chapa's version. Chapa was I'm going to be very short about this. Isolates, for instance, impermanence, this cup and the impermanence of the cup are one entity and different isolates. He didn't make that up. This comes at least from Kamala Shila. At least it was Kamala Shila, to my knowledge, who made that famous in India. Chapa Chokyi Senge, from my point of view, was addicted to the term isolate. And he loves the term isolate, much as many academics throughout the world have favorite terms that they love to get into their writings. During my stay at the University of Virginia, I noticed that academics throughout much of modern, so-called modern academia. I don't like the word modern academia because Tibetans didn't participate in some of the nonsense I'm going to talk about. And they're modern. They're alive nowadays, so they're modern. And they're academics, so, in the various colleges, so they're in academia. But when we use the term modern academia, we don't include them. It's prejudice. It's unfounded prejudice. Anyway, and if you say Western academia, where's Africa? Where's South America? Where's Australia? Is that in the West? Even where does the term Western come from? That's probably west of Genghis Khan. It's probably, I don't know, it's west of China. So I always like to say I'm traveling west to Tibet from here, from where I am. I'm not going east. I'm in Vancouver. That's west. And it's when one traces terms and then how they're used to put down other people, we have to struggle to find terms, modern, west, east, north, south. Anyway, Chapa just loves to put the word isolate at the end of, words like book isolate. Where's he coming from? Anyway, but it's just like there's nothing particularly Tibetan about it. It's just a fancy that he fell into and led his times. So when people say that Gelugpa scholars are at the peak of hoity-toity academics in Tibet, I say, no, you've got to go back a couple centuries, is it a couple or three, to Chapa Chokyi Senge, to have hoity-toity academics. Tsongkhapa and so forth are far from it. Tsongkhapa is far down the ladder. Okay. But there's no question he is one of the great scholars of Tibet. End of soliloquy. Although one of my students who's a wonderful scholar, Douglas Duckworth, who's particularly worked in Nyingma, was sitting in the back seat of a car one day when we were somewhere, some academic conference, and he leaned forward and said something like, oh, Chapa Chokyi Senge was a nut. He was crazy. And I wanted to hear his take on it because he knew more about Chapa than I did. And then he apologized and said, "Oh, I'm so sorry." And he didn't go on, and he didn't want to go on, so I didn't encourage him. But to this day, I've wondered what his case was. Anyway, another of my students at William and Mary studied a lot about the reception of Chandrakirti in Tibet and why his views became dominant. Anyway, I looked a lot into Chapa Chokyi Senge, and I'm sure has very different opinions. So anyway, we should get the two of them together in one room. So, as Daniel Perdue said, and I'm carrying on more and more, to add to what was said last time, Chapa, it appears, wrote the first collected topics in Tibet. That statement might hold up. Another of my students wrote the first collected topics. He certainly didn't begin debating because he wrote something to apparently, but maybe not true, put down nuns who are so good at debating, right? So there must have been a long tradition of debating already in Tibet at his time. Okay. All sorts of stories about people and traditions get started that weren't true at all. I won't tell you about some of the things that have been said about me that didn't have the slightest bit of truth. So some of this nitty-gritty material about which there'll be some different opinions keeps bringing us back to very central topics. Dependent arising comes up over and over again. The subject, the predicate, sprout or my body is a dependent arising. Very central topics come up over and over again. Amongst the nitty-gritty of settling this or that about dependent arising and about emptiness, we're drawn into thinking more and more about dependent arising and about emptiness. And whether this and that are realized at the same time, or whether there's a sequence of understandings about which there are different opinions, and we may get frustrated about whether it's a sequence or whether they occur at the same time. Still, we're drawn into thinking more and more and more about dependent arising, about emptiness, about the emptiness as a mere absence, about these very central topics. Our minds are stimulated into thinking more and more and more about the bedrock principles, because we're thinking about other topics concerning the bedrock principles, which is great. It's wonderful. Property of the subject. The subject is a sprout, or my body, meaning your body, or a cornstalk, or a house. The property of the subject is it's a dependent arising. And we end up with this bedrock principle of this and that is a dependent arising as just common stuff. So, the second sentence in this paragraph, he shows how Tsongapa's statements indicates that this means the first sentence. He holds that from the force itself of ascertaining that the reason is a property of the subject, from ascertaining that, a combination of what two? A sprout's emptiness of inherent existence and a sprout's dependent arising, these two, that combination, dawns to an inference. So the consequence is seeking to generate an inference. So he shows how Tsongapa's statements indicates that this combination is accomplished through reasoning by way of a consequence. It absurdly follows, blah, 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 not by way of a syllogism. I mean, you could use a syllogism, but you can use a consequence. Even though Tsongkhapa doesn't out and out say that, talk about consequences. So what does, and so then Hopkins gets back to quoting Dendal Haramba. So this is a commentary by Hopkins. It's called the prior commentary, and then Hopkins quotes Dendal Haramba. So, in the second line of this quote, the reason why the first line, why the combination dawns to that inference is a consciousness, is that this party, right, this person who's either doing it in meditation to herself, himself, has already realized that inherent existence, inherent establishment entails non-contingency, non-dependency on another. Wow. Is that how things, the way things appear to us involves non-contingency. Now, if you ask yourself, is there some sort of non-contingency involved in how this appears? You know, if you say, if you think about it, somebody had to make this. You know, somebody either had to give this to me, I don't remember, or I had to buy it. Somebody had to make it. Somebody had to, you know, get the materials, right? It had to be, I mean, it's not made of plastic. It wasn't just extruded like plastic. But if it were plastic, it'd have to be extruded. It's composed of a whole lot of substances. If you think about it, you wouldn't say that. You wouldn't admit to it. But is there something about the way it appears? It's almost like we're buffoons. We have to admit to being buffoons, clowns. And that's why we're led into such awful emotions. Yelling and screaming and plotting, and I'm going to get this and I'm going to get that, and I'll wait and get my chance. I'm going to pay this person back if it's the last thing I do. You know, if it's the last thing I do, really? I'm going to drive fast around this corner. which I don't know how often we say, I'm going to risk my life going around this corner. You know, openly say that. But even on this, if it's the last thing I do, we say that actually. But the way we act when driving, I'm thinking about when I was a teenager driving up to a stop sign. I couldn't stop. I had to. It was a T. And so I had to turn. I was going so fast. There were a couple other guys in the car. I was showing off about how fast I could stop. I had to slide around the corner. Fortunately, no one was coming. Is that this party has already realized that inherent establishment entails non-contingency on another. Non-contingency on another. Non-contingency through the functioning of the consequence. It falls the subject, my body does not rely on anything. I don't rely on anything till I get sick, old, because of being inherently established. So Tsongkhapa says, and this is what he milks out of, Denla Harma milks this out of what Tsongkhapa says. milks. God, that comes from milking the teats on a cow. That's an interesting thing you do when you first learn it. My oldest brother had me do it. He worked on a farm. Because they have realized that what is inherently established does not rely on another, and have realized with valid cognition that the two, this, and I had to think when I translated this, what does this mean? Non-reliant, inherent existence, independent arising, and contradictory. So that means when we buffoons look around, this means this stuff around us, which appears to be inherently existent and dependent arising, these things, this stuff, the way it seemingly appears, makes them impossible to be dependent arising. Their appearance is contradictory with dependent arising, which I claim to so love as a Buddhist. So Nagarjuna begins his praise of Buddha at the beginning of his treatise on the middle with whatever is a dependent arising. You Buddha, I bow down, it says at the end of that stanza, I bow down to you Buddha, the best of all teachers, unmatched teacher who taught that, and it begins with whatever is dependent arising. You think, is that so amazing? Has no cessation, no production. What? If it's independent arising, has no cessation, no production, coming, going, etc. What a wild. So when faced with the unwanted consequence, you can read it, an appropriate other party, other person, or yourself when you're meditating, if you're not too much of a buffoon, puts it together that inherent establishment entails non-reliance on another, and realizes that inherent establishment and arising just cannot go together. Now that means that you've gotten a handle on how things are appearing, and that dependent arising, dependence on causes, dependence on parts, is just plain impossible. The way things are appearing in any kind of dependence, thus, realization of the entailment occurs first. This forms the context for the subsequent understanding. That prompts. We had other words, triggers, prompts. Prompts is a good word, isn't it? Realization that my body is empty. Then, in the next quote from and so initially unlike in the autonomy school's version, that initially the property of the subject is established, you understand that, And after that, in order to establish the entailment, a common, what are the words we had? We had location and we had a better one. What was the word?
One was ground.
Common ground. Yeah. Because of, what's the Tibetan word?
Shi.
Yeah, it has she in it. Shitumba. Shitun. Sign and predicate of the, what word did we have for negandum? Predicate of what is negated? Is that all we came up with? In the note, because the long version is formal, classical, or just is the more formal one, I changed in this note, in the second sentence, it is that in a more formal, it says, in a simpler way. It is that in a simpler way, the autonomy school uses a two-membered statement. Instead of more formal, I changed it this morning to simpler because I was undermining Gendon Lotra's marvelously complex and I'm not sure about the word classical, but anyway. It certainly was the formal classical. Classical doesn't have to mean old, only old. Now we seem to have two things going on in this quote. Now the quote after the note. Two things, are they going on simultaneously or in series? Kind of looks like simultaneously, or does simultaneously mean in series? This is something we're going to have to look for down the road with both Dendal Haramba and the other scholars. Does simultaneously mean in close series, a very tight series, or does it mean at the same time? In the note, Hopkins says subsequent perception of the sprout under the influence of the realization of its emptiness. There are two things going on. To this inference, this inference meaning the inferential consciousness, right? In inference is a consciousness. There's the appearance perspective. If we take something outside, if we're reflecting on trying to realize the emptiness of the cup, it's full of coffee or half full of coffee. But we're not talking about that kind of emptiness. We're talking about its emptiness of inherent existence. If we realize the emptiness of its, by inference, if we realize the emptiness of inherent existence of the cup, does the cup appear to the appearance perspective of the cup. So let's talk about the appearance perspective and the ascertainment perspective. At that point, you're ascertaining the mere absence of inherent existence. To the appearance perspective, for instance, take off my glasses and look at when I look out the windows, there's a set of full-length windows. 1, 2, 3, 4, I think it's 5 windows, floor to ceiling, with double doors. They're door-length windows. And with full moon, without my glasses, I'll see a double moon. So to the appearance factor of my eyes, I'll see a double moon. But to the ascertainment factor of my mind, I know there's a single moon, just because I'm slightly grown up at age 80. So I know there's only one moon. I'm not shocked and say, call to people, call to my husband and say, hey, wake up. The moon gave birth to another moon. So when realizing the emptiness of the cup, does my mental consciousness, okay, I'm in meditation, and is the cup still appearing to the appearance factor, appearance perspective, which in Tibetan is nangor. Is the cup still appearing? But to the ngengor, in Tibetan, in English, the ascertainment factor is seeing just the mere absence of inherent existence. Okay? Now, some Tibetan scholars say both are happening. Still seeing the cup to the appearance perspective and to the ascertainment perspective, just ascertaining the mere absence of inherent existence. These two are going on at the same time. And some say to the appearance perspective, there's just a mere in Tibetan, dongsang, immaculate vacuity appears. You're not seeing any cup. And to the ascertainment perspective, you are ascertaining a mere absence of inherent existence. Two different views. Two different, I don't want to say theories. Theories seems to be too airy. But anyway, we'll say two views on what's happening when you get down to actual inference. Dendal Harma's opinion is the first. The cup is still appearing to the appearance perspective. Nango, I should say in Tibetan, Nango. And to the ascertainment perspective, in Tibetan, ngengor, that word nge, which comes up, ascertainment. Just the mere absence of inherent existence is ascertained. That's what he puts forward here.
Would the difference be just the depth of meditation? For example, if meditation is not so deep, both would appear, and if meditation would be very concentrated and deep, then only ascertainment of non-inherent existence would be there.
I've wondered. He doesn't say that. But I've wondered if along the way you get both, and then it goes deeper and you get just one. Is it the second or the fourth Panchen Lama who wrote this practice text that Geshe Wangyal himself and Thurman and myself separately translated and published? He holds that what appears is the immaculate vacuity. And Giant Sheba, as I remember, holds just the immaculate vacuity. He doesn't posit stages. And I've wondered, you wouldn't want to say, well, they're not, you really wouldn't want to say Dendar Haramba just didn't make it to the deeper stage. And but anyway, yeah, I've had the same thought as you just presented. If we think about the four levels, or four, I don't know what they're called, of the path of preparation before direct perception, of course, is a different situation. There's not going to be any appearance of conventionalities. And so that's why some people don't want to posit that, I think it's a reason why some people don't want to posit that there wouldn't be just an immaculate vacuity for inference. But there are many scholars who say even for inference, there's just this immaculate voidness or vacuity. Vacuity really would be, I think, more to the point, that is appearing to the appearance factor, if you have actual inference. So that's an interesting point. Another point for us to look for with the scholars that we'll be reading about. And why I began talking about what I did once I got off my soliloquy, it's that this can be frustrating. Well, what is it? But, it's like, who cares? It's more interesting. And as you say, one could pass through this stage and that stage, and it causes us to think more about what realizing emptiness is like. And, and along the way we're picking up emptiness in terms of ascertainment is a mere absence, right? In terms of ascertainment. And whether the thing that is emptiness has the quality of emptiness, whether it's still appearing or not, is an issue, but maybe it is or it isn't. It's lovely. I shouldn't be drinking that now. Then, that's one topic. The other topic, so that's what's going on with the inference that is generated. Then there is later, down inside this quote, and then it says, in the appearance of it as a dependent arising. Now, this can be what's he talking about here? Is he talking about during the session? Or is he talking about later, rising from the session, so to speak, there's two versions of arising from the session. You've ended your meditation on emptiness, and you're still sitting there, and then you're reflect. You've come out of your realization of emptiness and you're thinking about whatever it is. Or later, you're out and about and you're at the Safeway across the street, or I could go through the 4 supermarkets that are in our area. It's rather strange, because it's not that built up down at this West End. Or you're in another lifetime. And he's announcing, and the appearance of it as a dependent arising of it is from the force of realizing it as empty of an it as empty of inherent establishment. Now I'm paying more attention to this part of the quote than I have previously. Now, whereby. Now, from the and to the whereby, just before the whereby seems to explain the end clause. Whereby when the party sees sprouts and so forth, this person sees them as dependent arisings. And due to this also induces ascertainment that they're empty of inherent establishment. Now, I think when we come to Tsongkhapa's statement about this, we'll see that he's talking about even in other lifetimes. So we'll see this. And when Hopkins lays out the sequence, I think, with number 3, you see, it says that realization of the emptiness of inherent establishment affects subsequent perception of phenomena, such that they appear Oh, I don't think he's talking about a seesaw, a quick seesaw back to reflecting on dependent arisings. Dependent arising, reflecting on dependent arising prompted realization of emptiness, and then realization of emptiness prompts you right into realization of emptiness right away prompts you into realizing dependent arising. I don't think this is what he's talking about. Just as Hopkins says subsequent. Now look at what Tsongkhapa says. And therefore they become accustomed immediately upon seeing, hearing, or being mindful that sprouts and so forth rely. I'm not sure about this. Now I have to go back and find where Tsongkhapa says this is such that in other lifetimes, when you reflect on such, getting used to this is such that in other lifetimes, when you reflect on causation, you come to reflect on emptiness. I don't think I gave sufficient thought to what Dendal Larimba and Tsongkhapa were talking about. Through dependent arising itself, they gain ascertainment of the emptiness that negates inherent existence. And therefore they become accustomed. When they're going about in the world or whatever they're doing, you see, I don't think that Tsongkhapa or Dendal Larimba are talking about a 1, 2, 3, 4 jumping back and forth, 1, 2, 3, 4, then would have to repeat itself in the meditation almost as if you're, 1, 2, 3, 4, then gets repeated by 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 in your meditation. Not that you couldn't do this if you wanted, but so when Hopkins, see, I'm being stretched where I say when we go to the margin, Larimba has completed his profoundly complex presentation of how realization engendered by consequences can do, whereby he has avoided using the twofold reasoning, twofold formula of emptiness meaning of dependent arising, dependent arising meaning. Instead of this has given an explanation using these two perspectives in one realization. Now I think I should say in the first two of the four up above. And 3 and 4 are referring to what happens outside of the meditative session. When upon rising, whether you stood up or it doesn't make any difference. Now, I'm going to have to make that case if today I'm right, because he's got a statement that in another lifetime, whether it's in this lifetime or another lifetime, this has become so much the pattern of your mind that whenever you reflect on any kind of dependent arising, realization of emptiness is prompted. Three and four is prompted.
Jeffrey, can I ask you a personal question?
Please.
Sort of. As you're relating this, I'm reminded of a section in your notes about your bio of being a young boy and looking at the door jamb or whatever, the facings, whatever it was, that you realized that it was a dependent rising itself.
When I was doing what?
You were looking at the facings of a door, or something.
Yes.
Like the word for itself, and you realized that you appreciated the beauty of it, and you realized that it was also dependent on other things.
Exactly.
So it seems
That this
that your experience is reflecting exactly what you're postulating.
exactly, and that's what you're right. It's exactly what I'm talking about. That my realization that a carpenter made that so nice door, made the so nice stuff that door was made of, affected the way it was appearing to me, and you know, startled me, and you know, I was sitting down, but so to speak, set me back on my heels, profoundly affected me. So the causation, reflecting on causation, so that means that type of dependent arising. Yes, exactly. So you've understood what I'm talking from. And then the other point in my life story that I've been reflecting on, and later, to my detriment, in fifth grade, when the teacher began talking about causation, cause and effect, I was fascinated and wanted to know more about this, but I was quite dumb. Fortunately, I wanted to know more about cause and effect, but it did not prompt such a profound reaction. And you know, so but it's nice to have both memories at the same time this morning, and I've continuously had them as we've been working on this, and hoping that I would have both. Okay. See you next week, right?